Singer.
Here.
We do have a quorum this evening. She usually doesn't call me. That's nice. You called me.
That's going in order.
All right. The first item for item number 4 this evening is the public comment. Is there any member of the public in the audience tonight that wishes to address the board on any topic? If you're not on the agenda elsewhere. Yep. If you could come down to the microphone, if you can just state your name and address. You can sign in when you're done, and then you'll have 2 minutes.
There's no paper up there.
That's all right. If you just state your name and address, we'll cover it.
Hi, I'm Willie Miller. This is my wife, Cheryl Miller. Up there, we're at 200 Pine Ridge Lane. I don't know if this is the right time, but we have a street light out. So do I address that here?
You just did.
Okay,
Mark?
all right.
He's on it.
And also, there's a fishing pond across from us.
Mm-hmm.
And there's people that come over and they fish and they leave trash because there's no garbage can over there. And I was wondering if we could get a trash can over there. That way I won't have to pick up all the trash all the time.
Yeah, I hear you. Maybe Mark Wolf, our Director of Public Works, if you can connect with him, and he can kind of go over what where you're looking at it.
Okay. Again, like I say, I'm new here. I don't know how this thing works, if we're doing it right, or is this the time to do it?
Yeah, that's
So,
perfect.
That's all I...
You nailed it.
All right, great. Thank you.
So thanks for coming.
Could you state your address again for me so I make sure I get the appropriate location for the street light?
200 Ridge Lane.
Perfect.
And
Thank
Mark,
you.
Mark, will you get some contact information with him?
Yep,
Just because we don't have the clerk tonight. All right. Any other public comment? Perfect. Thanks for coming. All right, moving on to item B this evening is bid opening for the sale of 310 North River Street.
We did not receive any bids.
Nothing to open. Thank you. All right. Item 5 this evening is a consent agenda. I'll read the items, entertain a motion. Minutes of the Village Board meeting of September 27th. Executive session minutes for September 27th. Building report for September of 2021. Accounts receivable report for September of 2021. The water production report for September of 2021. And accounts payable through October 7th.
So moved.
Second.
Trustee Marisak.
Yes.
Trustee Betzinger.
Yes.
Trustee Guyer.
Yes.
Trustee Spurling.
Yes.
Trustee Bauman.
Yes.
And Trustee Youngerman.
Yes.
That carries 6-0, thank you. All right, items for separate action this evening. We have A is a recommendation of the Planning and Zoning Commission, PZC 2021-014, text amendments to various sections of Village's UDO, and then Ordinance 1929 approving that text amendment. And we're asking for a waiver of first, passage on the second reading. We'll discuss these and vote together, but vote independently.
Thank you. So back on March 8th, the village adopted our new Unified Development Ordinance that serves as our zoning ordinance and subdivision ordinance for the village. As we've begun to enforce and implement this UDO, we've come across a few errors and omissions in some areas where some clarification would be helpful. So we've proposed various amendments to make those corrections and clarifications. Additionally, the board did direct staff and the Planning and Zoning Commission to consider increasing the fence height in residential districts to 6 feet for fences in the side yards and rear yards. So the text amendment before you does incorporate all of those changes, specifically fence heights, clarifications for outdoor storage, some changes to parking regulations, making some clarifications there and fixing some omissions, landscaping and screening regulations, some clarifications on fence materials, non-conforming uses, and some various typographical errors found throughout the ordinance. So the Planning and Zoning Commission held their public hearing on August 7th for this amendment, and they recommended approval on a motion that passed 6-0. And you have the ordinance before you as well.
Awesome, thank you. Was there any public comment at Plan Commission?
Regarding the fences, we had one resident that was there that was in favor of the increase to the 6 foot in height.
Got it. Was that the same resident that was here?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Any other questions from staff? Is there a motion?
Move to,
Hold on. Real quick, this is item A, the recommendation from Plan Commission. Go ahead.
I move to accept the recommendation of the Plan Commission. Oh, my glasses. No, sorry.
Item A, that's all you got to say.
Item A.
There you go. Second.
Trustee Spurling?
Yes.
Trustee Bauman?
Yes.
Trustee Youngerman?
Yes.
Trustee Marisak?
Yes.
Trustee Betzinger?
Yeah.
And Trustee Guyer?
That carries 6-0. Thank you. All right, item B then is the enacting ordinance, 1929. This is a waiver of first passage on the second.
Move to approve?
Second. Any further discussion?
Trustee Spurling?
Yes.
Trustee Bauman?
Yes.
Trustee Youngerman?
Yes.
Trustee Marisak?
Yes.
Trustee Betzinger?
Yes.
And Trustee Guyer?
Yes. That carries 6-0. Thank you. All right, item C for separate action is a recommendation of Planning and Zoning Commission on 2021-012, a special use and PUD amendment for Strickland Brothers Oil and Lube. And then item D is the first reading of the enacting ordinance that we're not voting on this evening. Director Abt.
Yes, so Strickland Brothers is requesting both a special use for a motor vehicle repair and service center, as well as an amendment to the special use for the Orchard Crossings PUD. They are going to be locating in the vacant lot that's between the bank and the Burger King over there at Orchard and 30. That's Zone B2, and motor vehicle service is a special use in the B2. Additionally, the PUD only allows for the existing motor vehicle service that is out there, and says that it would need to be amended to allow another. So they're also requesting that amendment to the PUD. I can go over access and stuff if you want, but at the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting, we did have Mike's, the owner of Mike's, come to the public hearing and ask some questions about access, and just make some comments that it is a little bit tough out there, and he did have some concerns about the cross-access. I think after that discussion, he felt a little bit better about it, because it would be providing additional access into that area, and now that that lot would be developed, so it would have access all the way across to the bank. And so people would be able to come in that way and gain access for any of the uses out there, and similarly would be able to exit that way as well. So the Planning and Zoning Commission did recommend approval of the special use, as well as the amendment to the special use with conditions. The special use passed 4-2, and the amendment to the PUD passed 5-1.
And I know it's probably in here, but have they met those conditions, or are they conditions that will ride?
They're ones we still have to get revised plans for.
Got it. So this is approval with those same conditions?
Yes.
Okay. All right, any questions of staff? And is the petitioner here?
I believe so, yes.
Perfect. Any questions of the petitioner? All right. Hearing none, I'll entertain a motion on item C, the recommendation of Plan Commission.
So moved. Second.
Go ahead.
Trustee Marisak? Yes. Trustee Betzinger? Yes. Trustee Guyer? Yes. Trustee Spurling?
Yes.
Trustee Bauman?
Yes.
And Trustee Youngerman?
Yes.
And that carries 6-0, thank you. And then the item D this evening is ordinance 1930, granting a special use for that. And this is first reading. This will be on for separate action at a future meeting. Thank you. All right, thanks. All right, moving on. Items for discussion this evening. We have the Caterpillar Drive TIF District, TIF 3 eligibility study update. And who wants to take this one? Intro.
Oh, I've got,
Sonia?
as you know, we began the TIF study process. We hired Tesca Associates to begin analyzing the area and see if it is meeting the state requirements for establishing a TIF district for that area. So we've got Pete Asso with Tesca here to give you an update on his eligibility report and what next steps are.
Awesome, thank you. And I didn't catch your name, I'm sorry.
Pete,
Pete?
I-O-S-U-E.
All right, welcome.
I understand you have quite an agenda tonight, so I will be brief. As Sonia said, my name's Pete. I'm with Tesca Associates. We've been working with Sonia and your TIF attorney on looking at the eligibility of the Caterpillar facility for potential designation as a TIF district. I have toured the facility with the developer, took a ton of pictures, did a ton of research. I did prepare, we went through a number of drafts of the eligibility report, as well as we've got the redevelopment plan completed. So we've basically got a full TIF plan that is ready to go. The area does qualify pretty easily. There's a number of ways to qualify a TIF district in the TIF Act. The two main ones is a conservation area and a blighted area, which is essentially the threshold for the number of criteria that you have to meet to hit those levels. This particular area that we studied hits 5 of the TIF eligibility criteria, which would qualify it as either a conservation area or a blighted area. I tend to use conservation area just because I don't like to call things blighted unless I have to, but it meets both of those thresholds. One thing to note is we originally started with a much bigger area. Had tried to, well, the village had requested that we look at some properties surrounding the Caterpillar facility, which were primarily just farmland, which is extremely difficult to qualify for a TIF district. It's not that you can't do it, but the bar is much higher for undeveloped land as opposed to developed land. And the TIF Act is particularly hard on property that's being used for commercial farming. So I did what I could. I couldn't get those areas to qualify, so we settled on just basically the Caterpillar property. So the TIF plan is ready to go. You know, a couple of the big things that I'm not sure how far along you guys are with the actual annexation of the property. Obviously, that would have to be, we can start the approval process as long as the property is actually annexed into the village before final approval. And basically, the steps that are remaining is we have to hold a joint review board, which is basically, we'll send the copy to all the affected taxing districts, the school district, everybody who's levies taxes within the proposed area. We have a meeting with those taxing districts to get their comments. They're a recommending body. They'll make a recommendation to this board here. And then we'll have a public hearing, which will notify all the property owners and everyone within 750 feet, at which point then the village board can vote on it. Ideally, if you want to approve the TIF, you want to do it at the beginning of the year as opposed to at the end of the year, because whatever date you actually adopt the TIF, that's technically the first year of the TIF, and since the years are limited, you have 23 years. If you would adopt it in October now or November, this would be your first year, and you basically wouldn't get any increments, so you'd basically be shooting yourself in the foot. So we're right on schedule. We could theoretically, hold all those meetings, do all those notices before the end of the year, and you have 90 days once you hold that public hearing to vote on it. So the main factor, though, is we have to pick a public hearing date, and the board has to pass an ordinance or a resolution to officially establish that date that's required in the TIF Act. Once you do that, then I'll handle all the notice to the taxing districts, all the property owners, and we can hit all those requirements of the TIF Act. That's kind of it in a nutshell. I'm happy to answer any questions anyone has. If you have any specifics on the eligibility of the area or how we came up with the plan, I'm happy to answer those.
Can you just repeat that part about we have to approve the date for when the TIF starts? Is that what you said?
No, we have to hold, basically the two main steps we have to do that is the meeting with the taxing districts, the joint review board, and then just a public hearing.
Okay, so we need to pass something for the public hearing date.
Right, you just have
Okay.
to, just a simple, basically a sentence, we're setting the
Somehow
public
I
hearing
didn't
date
catch all
for
that,
this
so.
date. But
Thank you.
for some reason, that's a requirement built into the TIF Act that you have to actually pass an ordinance to set that date.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions for staff or for Pete?
I do have one. On the report, it says draft report, May 2021. Is this actually draft report for October 2021 or the final report?
I think, Sonia, you can correct
It's a
me?
draft. The final one will have the exclusion of the other one and will be included as an exhibit to the plan.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
All right, great. Thanks for your time, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay. With that, moving on to items for discussion this evening is the second item for discussion is the alternate water source supply presentation. Mr. Freeman, I was just conversing with Jeff to see if we should take a washroom break now or halfway through the presentation. Since it's only been a few minutes, hopefully we can go for a little bit, and then Jeff, if you have a good place to take a break,
Sounds good.
take a break. You know, this is a pretty detailed presentation. Thanks, Pete. We won't be offended if you leave. Same with,
A little interested.
yeah, with you guys. So it is a lengthy presentation. There's a lot of meat and potatoes in it. So ask questions. I messaged the board individually. Please ask questions as you go. If something comes up, feel free to interrupt Jeff, keep him on his toes. But the point here tonight is not to make a decision. It's to get the information, chew on it, and then we'll have more conversations over the next couple of months. So with that, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Mayor Browley and the Village Board. Appreciate the opportunity to come before you tonight. We, as a board, our village, had started the alternate water source study in earnest back in 2015, 2016. For those that were on the board, probably remember a couple presentations in the past, and then we even talked about this a little bit previously throughout this year. When it started back in 15, 16, there was about 3 alternatives that the village was evaluating. Since then, there's been a couple more, continued to evolve, and tonight we're going to talk about 6 different alternatives for your consideration. In the end, it's good to have alternatives, right? But what we really need to do as a group is walk through them and identify what components or key considerations make the most amount of sense for you within each one of the alternatives. And then the goal, I believe, is to look at making some sort of selection by the end of the year. The way that the presentation is structured is as identified on this slide. We're going to give a very brief overview of your existing system just to make sure everybody has that foundation to start with. Then we're going to talk about water source sustainability in the specific alternatives and what is considered sustainable. That's a huge part of this consideration. Again, for those that have been part of this before, you know that. For those that haven't been part of some of these discussions, you know, that's a key consideration here for sure. We will talk about the previous studies, just to give you a little bit of background on that, because we're building on those. Then we're going to get into the Village of Montgomery on its own and some of the background information for that, as well as the Waterlink communities. And if you did not know, Oswego, Yorkville, and Montgomery, I guess through the Oswego Water Study, have developed the branding for the 3 communities if you go jointly as the Waterlink communities, so you'll see that verbiage throughout. The key considerations, introduction, so after we set the foundation for everything else, we're going to talk about what might be some of the key considerations that you would take into account when evaluating these alternatives. Want to introduce those before we start going through all the supply alternatives, which is item number 6 there. And then with a very, very long drum roll, we'll finally get to the cost estimates, summary, and financial analysis. From there, we'll just briefly talk about schedule, and then we'll go back to the key considerations and summarize them all together, and then talk about what the next steps are. Like Mayor Browley had said, certainly willing to, or please provide questions as we go. Probably easiest to just bring them up on the slides that we're talking about rather than getting through all, I think there's 74. So having to go backwards from there might be a bit of a challenge, and it would be easier for you, I think, to get out the questions as early as possible. All right, jumping into the existing waterworks system. The village has 9 active water wells throughout the community. 4 of those are considered shallow, either sand and gravel or limestone wells. 5 of those 9 wells are what's called the deep sandstone aquifer wells. 3 of them are in 2 of the formation, St. Peter and Ironton-Galesville, and 2 of them are in the Ironton-Galesville only. The capacity is from 200 for the shallow wells up to over 1,000 for the deep, and the deep wells exceed the radium content, which is the primary reason to start with for treatment, and then secondarily, your shallow wells are high in iron. In all cases, you soften the water, though, before you send it out to the residents. You soften it at 3 water treatment plants. The main treatment plant in the middle of town is the lime softening water treatment plant, and then you have 2 on the outer, one on the west, one on the east side, that are ion exchange treatment plants. The water quality from all 3 is very similar. From a storage perspective, you have 2 underground or groundwater storage tanks. Those vary in size from 300,000 up over $1 million, or up to $1 million. And then your 4 elevated tanks, which I'm sure are a little easier to spot throughout the community, with your east and west tanks, multi-leg tanks at 750,000, and then the largest one, the 2 million gallon tank out west. There's a SCADA system that operates the whole system. From a distribution perspective, because of the topography of the village, you have 3 different pressure zones. You can see that on the map, and that's important because when we're talking about the different alternatives where we bring that water into the system, makes a difference, and then how it can be distributed across the system overall. To be able to transfer that water, you have 2 booster pump stations and 1 PRV. Getting into sustainability then, this is a pie cutout, I guess, or maybe a brownie cutout, whatever your favorite shape of dessert is, for the geology underneath northeastern Illinois. And starting from the surface, you work through the drift, which is over top of the bedrock surfaces, and then there's multiple bedrock formations. The deep sandstone aquifers, like I mentioned before, is the St. Peter and Ironton-Galesville. You can see those on the left. And then there is actually one that's even deeper, the Mount Simon, but in this area of Illinois, the Mount Simon is often brackish to the point where it gets to be saline and is really not an option. There are communities up north that can drill into the Mount Simon, but in this area in particular, it would not be an option. So you're in the St. Peter, you're into the Ironton-Galesville. It has radium in it, hence the reason for treatment. Water levels have been declining for quite a period of time. The State Water Survey has been studying the aquifer for many years now, over a decade. And the water levels have dropped. They predicted from pre-development age to now to on the order of 700 to 800 feet deep. And based on the continuing withdrawals from the aquifer, the water levels will continue to decline. There's simply not sufficient amount of water in the aquifer. We're pumping it beyond its sustainable yield, and it will continue to decline. Therefore, a lot of communities are moving off of that aquifer, including the city of Juliet, as well as a number in their area. And then, of course, your neighbors, Yorkville and Oswego, are considering it as well. Like I mentioned, the State Water Survey has been modeling this for over a decade now. And just to try to drill this point home a little bit more, have some exhibits that they created. We're going to walk through the average day and the peak water use and their projected water levels in the deep aquifer over time. The exhibit up top here on the left, just to identify some of the geographical components to it, the county boundaries are on there, so you can see where Will is and Kendall is, and then where Grundy is down south, and then to get your orientation of where Montgomery, Oswego, and Yorkville are, with Montgomery being the orange star. The yellow for 2020 means that all of your deep wells currently have a risk of declining well performance. And then if it was to get to the brown or the darker orange, then you have the risk of your wells actually being dewatered and can no longer be in use. So for now, it's, I guess, in the risk of declining well performance in the area. Once we go out to 2050, though, there's a good chance that one of your wells or possibly multiple wells could be to the point where they're no longer operable and would not be able to provide water to your system. If we go out to 2070, the brown area gets larger over time, and it would be even worse. This modeling effort does include taking the city of Juliet off of the deep aquifer system, so even with that withdrawal being removed, there still will be challenges. Looking at the peak water use, so this would be the middle of the summer typically when there's higher demand in the system and the wells are pumped at for longer periods of time and producing more water, things only get worse. When you go out in time, the brown areas get larger, the orange areas as well, and then you can see that in 2070, a good portion of the region has the risk of wells being inoperable.
Real quick, sorry, my
Yes.
microphone was off. The risk of declining well performance. So we're currently in that now. What does that mean? Have we seen, like, what is declining well performance?
So, trying to do this without getting too into the parameters, but basically the well production is based on the efficiency of the aquifer. How much you can pump out of it based on how much the water levels decline. As the water levels continue to decline from a non-pumping water perspective, what the State Water Survey has seen in other areas is the efficiency of the aquifer reduces. So if you have the same pump and motor that would normally pump 1,000 gallons per minute, and you get, water levels decline enough to affect its ability for well performance, then it might only be pumping 900 gallons per minute. So you start to lose the capacity of that well, capacity of being able to pump into the system.
And are we currently seeing that in any of our pumps that we know of?
Well, so what happens is the village is on a really good schedule to be able to change out their pumping motors every 7 years. So typically, when we get to that point with the rehab, if the water levels have lowered enough, then we can add another bowl to the pump to be able to get that production back up. So we haven't seen it as much to where it's that obvious from a declining perspective, but over time, if we looked at this for another 10 years, I would like to think that you probably would.
Okay.
I have a question for staff. Jeff had hit up upon the changing out of the well pump motors. That's a budgeted cost that we have for each year, correct?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
So in conclusion, if it was not obvious, the deep sandstone formation in this area in a good portion of northeast Illinois is not sustainable. Another water source within reach, certainly, for the village of Montgomery is the Fox River. The Fox River, if you did not know, is used as a source of water for both the city of Elgin and the city of Aurora. The State Water Survey also did modeling on the Fox River, and what they had found was that over time, they are projecting the base flow in the river to go up. So the chart on the left in the bottom, the blue line is showing modern day levels in the Fox River. The orange line is showing future projections. Primary reason why is with the thought of additional water use within the watershed, most likely through groundwater upstream of the Montgomery area. Once that water is used and then ultimately discharged after treatment into the Fox River, then it would come down to this area and generally water levels would go up. The charts to the right, or the tables to the right, look at the fact that the risk of the wells dropping below the low flow restriction level, often referred to as the Q710, go down over time because the base flow in the river is going up. Should probably comment a little bit more on that Q710. Based on the way IDNR issues permits for withdrawals these days, from the Fox River or an inland river, there would be a point where they would not allow withdrawal from that river anymore, meaning if the water levels or flow drop below a certain level, then the village would have to go on a backup source of supply. Elgin and Aurora actually do not have that requirement within their permit, but any new withdrawals from the Fox River would. That's why it's very important for us to understand what the risk is for those water levels to go below that flow level in the river. Again, what the tables show is the current conditions in a given month, say September, there's a 4.7% chance in any given year that the level would drop below that level. However, in the future, out to 2050, that drops below 1% of a concern.
I have a question, and I've looked at some of I know what the 6 options are, and I've kind of looked at stuff. One of those options is connecting with Aurora. If Aurora already has that permit where they have essentially an unrestricted, they can take the water unrestricted according to the state or IDNR. Mm-hmm. If we connect with them, does that permit translate to us as well?
So if you were connected to their system, it seems like there is a potential that they would not have that reflected in their permit. However, that's something that I think Aurora would have to look into. This working through things, continue to work things with Aurora. IDNR in the past has said that, in some considerations, if your service area gets much larger, for instance, than what you're serving, then they could revisit that permit. So that would have to be something, it's a very good point, something to look at.
Can I ask you a really random question?
Sure.
So let's say Oswego, Montgomery, and Yorkville all go to Lake Michigan. We start getting water from there, and 2 of these communities are on Fox Metro right now, and thus discharging into the Fox River. Like, order of magnitude, that's not like a huge increase in flow in the Fox River, right? Because we're taking water out of the lake and putting it into Fox River?
It's not,
tiny?
I don't know percentage-wise, Pete, if you've got like the CFS versus.
So it depends on the time of year, but in perspective, in the entire Fox River, at this location, you might see a maximum of 50% of the flow being wastewater discharges at any given time, in the summer when you have low flows. So it wouldn't be significant, no.
Okay.
Especially if you consider, flood flows.
So it's no different than the aquifer running
True.
water, right? Because it doesn't matter where the water's coming from, it's not coming from the river.
Right.
We're pumping from the aquifer now, and we're putting in water, and we're gonna put the same amount of water in. It just,
Right.
it's coming from a different location.
Exactly.
Unless, if we were taking river water, then we're affecting the downstream flow.
Yes, but, if you're taking river water, you're returning it, so ultimately it's just a circle, and very common, of course, throughout the United States. So with that, we've concluded that the river is sustainable. That being said, like I said, there will be times where it could go below the Q710 if you're on your own, and therefore you have to have your wells that continue to connect to the lime softening plant to be able to treat those and distribute them. For Aurora, they do that as well. They have their network of shallow and deep wells that are connected to their lime softening plant. They supplement Fox River water all the time, and in cases where the Fox River is either poor water quality or low flows, then they'll reduce their withdrawal from the river and add, well water to make up the needed demand.
And you would need to keep those flowing anyways, just to exercise them?
For your wells, yes. If you maintain them as a backup supply, you would be required by the IEPA to pump them at least once a month for the sampling. And then you would consider, if you want to do it any more than that. One thing I think you would consider if you went to connect to Aurora is whether or not, as a reduction in your capital investment for that connection, is to allow them to connect to some of your wells and have that as part of their overall well network.
That was kind of my question, Doug. So, a question for staff. We're going to keep the appropriate people on staff once whatever option we choose, because we're still going to have our lime water, our lime softening plant, and our wells that we've got to maintain, correct?
So that hasn't been determined yet. Depending on the source that we would go with would depend on whether or not the lime softening plant itself would stay intact or not, as well as the ion exchange plants, whether or not it'd be feasible for those to remain in an idle position, in which time we would need them and be ready to go. So that hasn't been determined yet. Again, based upon different sources, we'll have different end results. So the degree of license that some of the operators may have to have for certain systems would definitely change, depending on certain sources too.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
So I can't remember the name of it, but there's an area up north, a lot of boating communities.
Chain of Lakes?
Thank you, Chain of Lakes. Do they have any, is there some kind of control up there where they can open up the river for more flow or close it off as needed?
Yes.
So then how does that come into play with our wanting to use water to live off of versus
Sure.
recreation?
Well, there's definitely competing uses throughout the river, and that is, something that they manage up north. but there's also a need to maintain a certain base flow within the river for ecological reasons. So I don't ever see a situation where they would essentially just fully close it off because of consider the ecological issues that that would create overall. Again, that's, you know, if it gets to the point where they're holding back water, there's a drought, and there's limited water in the river, it gets below the Q710, you would have your groundwater wells for backup to be able to treat them, and then distribute it out to the community.
And we are projecting that there would be enough still in the wells as a backup out for 50 years.
Yes, yes, exactly. So this, of course, assumes that your neighbors are all going off as well. Like I said, Aurora does use groundwater for their backup supply. So if everybody else went off and, you know, you were using it as a backup supply along with Aurora, there would still be some competed uses, as well as there's some other communities in your vicinity that use it. But based on, you know, the limited amount of withdrawals from the aquifer that you would take, we believe that there would be at least 50 years of capacity available.
And with the modeling, I do see you've touched a little bit on drought years as well. Even this summer, just going across the bridge, you could see how low the river was, and
Correct.
That was very concerning to me, knowing we have this decision coming up and the discussion and these different options, and it just my, you know, general, not like deep into it like the engineers are, just looking at it, it was kind of scary to even think that that's a potential option for us because it looked really low.
Sure. Yes, I understand it was very low. I didn't see it myself, but I've heard that several times, so that's a consideration.
So if I can just add to the issue on the Stratton Dam and the management of the pool above it, it doesn't have very much storage in the Stratton Dam. DNR actively manages that, controls the dam and the discharges, but it wouldn't really impact that 7-day, 10-year low flow. There's just not enough storage in that pool to, you know, offset it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and then the third source of supply, currently not within the village, I would say within the region, although, you know, the furthest extents would still need some capacity increases to be able to get it to the village, is the Lake Michigan. And Lake Michigan is, by Illinois Supreme Court decree, allowed, the state of Illinois has allowed a diversion up to 3,200 CFS for all of the diversions related to Lake Michigan, including the reversal of the Chicago River, stormwater that should have flowed into Lake Michigan, and then the diversions related to water supply. Department of Natural Resources manages the allocation process from Lake Michigan. It's actually a different group at IDNR that would manage the Fox River withdrawals, and they've recently stated that they believe there is sufficient allocation to serve Juliet and the communities currently considering connection, which would of course be you, through the Dupage Water Commission, through Juliet Area Commission, or even through the Illinois Lake Water System. The blue areas on this map are all areas that have Lake Michigan water, and you can see how the water is distributed from Chicago, in most cases, out. As you get north, there's other withdrawals in treatment plants from Lake Michigan. You'll see that there are some dots that get pretty close and some blue communities that get pretty close, but in all those instances, or in many of those instances, you can't connect directly to that community because there isn't sufficient capacity. You have to go back within the system where there is sufficient capacity to be able to meet the demands for Montgomery, and if you go with Oswego and Yorkville. On the well side of things here, while you're not required to keep your wells in service, it's recommended that you do. You'll see in the Lake Michigan alternatives, when we start talking about those, that we're talking about one transmission main that's coming out from an area that in some cases is tens of miles of length. Well, if there's a service interruption on that transmission main, we think it's good for you to have your wells ready to go to be able to distribute the water into the system. That's very common. Many, I would say most municipalities that are on Lake Michigan water do have backup wells for when, if and when they are needed.
Quick question for you.
Yes, sir.
in those communities, do they maintain the backup wells at the same level as they did? If we were to source Lake Michigan, would we need all the wells that we currently have operating today kept at the same level for backup? You understand what I'm saying?
Oh, definitely, yes. So remember, you have shallow and you have deep. It's difficult to maintain shallow wells with very limited pumpage out of them because it has high iron. So I would say the first thing you would consider is probably abandoning them because you're just not going to use them enough. They're lower in capacity anyway. And then you would look at the deep wells that you have to determine, what is our demand going to be? Are we going to be able to meet our average day demand, for instance? Could we actually abandon one and still meet our maximum day demand? Evaluate the risk based on what you want to achieve.
And do you have, and maybe you know, maybe you don't, frequency or expectation of service disruption from those who are mainlanding out of Lake Michigan? Is that an annual occurrence? Is it once every 6 or 7 years? There's something somewhere one time for a short period of time, days? I'm just trying to get an idea of the frequency of service disruption should we end up going down that road.
Certainly. Within the two main systems that we're looking at, or well, I guess the one system isn't created, but you assume that from the city of Chicago getting their water and bringing it out, and then comparative to the Dupage Water Commission system, I would say not very often. Like most communities could go 10, 15, 20 years, and maybe some have never even had to turn their wells on. That's not the case for, say, all Lake Michigan systems. There are some systems that have issues with frazzle ice. So when Lake Michigan ices over, their intake at times can get clogged up and then can create some challenges for them. And they have had, some of their communities have had to go on backup wells, but I don't know of actually too many service disruptions for Dupage Water Commission. I would assume Juliet would be similar, being that they're both getting from the city of Chicago.
Is that documented anywhere?
For the service disruptions?
Yeah.
Not specifically, but we could certainly reach out to the Dupage Water Commission.
I mean, it's a valid point.
Yeah, yes.
And again, we're still talking about having to maintain our current system. Even if we go Michigan, Dupage, we still have to maintain our system as an emergency backup plan, and we still have to exercise them.
Yes, yes, and like Mr. Wolf stated, you would probably, once you select the alternative, look at, again, the risk of being out of service and what level of, not only, which wells you want to keep online, but do you really want to keep the water treatment plants ready to go? So if you're not going to really need a water treatment plant once in every 20 years, is it worth trying to continue to maintain that for 20 years? Because to turn those water treatment plants back on after not really being used for 20 years is going to be a challenge. But keeping the wells, you could keep the wells, have them ready, that in a situation where you needed water, you pump the wells directly into the system, just not through the ion exchange or lime softening plant. The hardness would go up in those instances, and the radium content will go up. There's a chance that if it's just limited use of that water, that you would not be in violation of the radium standard, because the radium standard is an average of 4 quarters. So if you had 1 quarter, for instance, that was a little bit high, you could average out for the other 3 quarters and still be able to meet that standard.
Would you chlorinate though, or no?
Yes, you would have to chlorinate for sure. So we would have to maintain the ability to chlorinate. In some communities, they'll essentially, switch over to like a liquid chlorine and just leave space where you'd bring in a tote of liquid chlorine in these type of situations, be able to pump it into the system. You could potentially keep the gas around if you wanted to too, but again, for something that's just gonna sit there for 10, 20 years without use, may not be the best use of having that chlorine around.
Add phosphate for iron management too, or?
Probably. The Chicago system does add phosphate, so it'd be good to have that. You'd have to look at, you'd probably have to add fluoride. I know 8 fluoride is okay, but I can't remember exactly what 4 and 3 and 14 and 15 look like.
Yeah, I don't think we're adding fluoride anywhere now.
At
Unless
any
they
of them.
reduce the standard,
Right.
yeah, other than the lime softening plant.
All right, good questions. Now we're going to talk a little bit about those previous studies, because again, we're building on this as we continue to move through the overall presentation. Back in 2016, it actually started in 15, and then things were finalized in 16. The village embarked on looking at the Fox River as an independent source. We're going to talk about that tonight. And then during that same time period, we, as a village, also looked at joining with Yorkville and Oswego for the Fox River, and which is now, again, the three communities being the Waterlink. So we started that process by looking at population and water demand projections, looked at the regulations, and at that time did very detailed modeling with the State Water Survey to look at the sustainability of the aquifer, which started us down that path. We looked at the wells, if there was a chance to be able to keep them online, what type of costs would be associated with that, but concluded that they were not a sustainable long-term source. And then again, looked at Fox River alone, along with Oswego and Yorkville. A couple years later, 2017, 2018, the Dupage Water Commission had approached Oswego and then the region to see if there was the potential of bringing Lake Michigan water down from the Dupage Water Commission with a connection to their main transmission main at 75th and Book, which is on the west side of Naperville, just east of Route 59. AECOM, a consultant that generally works for Dupage Water Commission, went through, developed a cost estimate for that alternative, and then the group, meaning the Village of Montgomery, as well as the other communities, looked at how those costs compared to going to the Fox River. No decisions at that time were really made, still evaluating options. Then we get to 2020, 2021, another new alternative comes into play, namely the City of Joliet's Water Commission, or the Water Commission in the Joliet area. The Village of Oswego proceeded to move forward on a water study to evaluate all of the past alternatives plus the new alternative, and they asked if Montgomery and Yorkville would like to join them as part of the study. With that, they asked that Montgomery and Yorkville provide demand projections for them, updated demand projections, which we'll show you in a little bit, and then commentary on the decision matrix, and then what Montgomery and Yorkville were to get out of it after you had jointly funded the project was additional deep sandstone aquifer analysis, like those charts that I showed earlier with the orange and brown, updated cost estimates so that everything was compared in the same time frame, basically focusing in 2020, 2021. And then as part of that contract, there's a public engagement campaign with a consultant that is hired to help work through this process. We then worked with the village to determine what other components needed to be considered to be able to get everything onto this apples to apples comparison, developed the scope, and you approved it. Tonight, taking the Oswego information, taking what we did, we're putting it all together to present to you. So looking at the cost analysis for the Waterlink system and the Lake Michigan alternatives to get them to a comparison. You'll see that at the very end. We also, once you get this water to your system, like I had said, you got to distribute it across the system. So we utilizes the village model for all the water model for all the different alternatives to evaluate what improvements were needed as part of that, because in some cases they could be significant. And then also we looked at Montgomery alone going to the Fox River. That wasn't something that Oswego was going to evaluate, so we updated all of those costs and then added it to the comparison. Okay, getting into the population and water demands. For the Village of Montgomery, and there's reason to comment on the other communities because it does affect the overall analysis, but for you, things didn't change much. The current population, and whenever we're referencing population as part of this discussion, it includes the village's corporate limits, but it also includes Boulder Hill subdivision, because Boulder Hill you provide water to in that unincorporated subdivision. Today, the combined population is 28,700-ish. CMAP, Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, is projecting that the combined population out in 2050 is going to be about 42,000. The original master plan projection is in that gray-orange dot, so they, and at that time, CMAP didn't have all the way out to 2050, they just had to 2040, so we had projected it out beyond 2040 to 2050 with the same growth rate. CMAP has since gone out to 2050. They have kind of that weird elbow there where it's looking like maybe some extra growth is going to happen from 2045 to 2050. If anybody wants to put a bet down on that, I'll take it, because I don't know how you do that, but they did. In any event, the total build-out for the village is set because your planning boundary is set. You have a certain amount of open area pretty much remaining. So everything kind of maxes out at 42,000 in combined population. For us, we go in Yorkville, just so you know that's not the case. They have area that would build beyond 2050. And with them, the original 2015-2016 population projections were higher to moderately higher than what they are today. So things were scaled back based on CMAP's projections for them. Again, you were fixed based on your build-out projection. So the total system, when you consider all three together, did get smaller over time because the population and then water demand to go with it went down. For your system, you've got the blue lines are showing your historical water use. On the left side, average day, on the right side, max day. So relatively consistent, and one can even say that your average day trend is generally going down a little bit. But if you project out with your population projection, we're looking at a 2050 average day of 3.4 MGD and a max day of 5.53. One of the things to consider is, with each one of these alternatives, it's going to take some time. Some could potentially be implemented sooner rather than later if you want to, but there could also be a reason maybe to delay them. Others, it will just take longer to be able to get the project implemented. We wanted to look and see, with your existing capacity, your system, again, your 9 wells, your treatment plant, is there going to be a point in time before you can get anything implemented that you might need a new well or a treatment plant expansion, what that cost might be, and if it even, registers as a consideration. For you, you're good from a supply perspective. It's not until close to 2050 where you might even need additional supply. And then on the storage side, you have sufficient storage within your system based on the current system. That's going to differ when we talk about Lake Michigan systems because they have a higher level of storage that's required.
Yeah, just a question on this. So if I'm looking at this, the orange represents on the left, represents the amount of, I'm just trying to digest this real quick. That's our capacity over time, right?
Correct.
And where are we at today? Point to today.
So 2020, so the orange is the projected based on the demands that we had projected before. So recall that we had kind of higher levels of projection back here based on your demands. Things have gone down a little bit. And then taking into account, population and just running out in time, this is what it is. The blue is what has occurred actually as far as your pumping levels based on that maximum day. So, if it follows through with the trend, you're at 2047. If, for instance, the village, did even a higher level of water conservation, then it may never cross the zero line and you may continue to have capacity. Or if somehow, for some reason, there was repetitive droughts, and even with the even odd lawn watering, people were just watering a lot and your max day demands went up, then there's the chance that, the levels could come down and impact or hit cross the zero line earlier.
Got it. What's the blue dot with the circle?
Blue dot with the circle was the 2021 maximum day that we had in the system, which was earlier in the year. So we haven't gotten that updated information, for instance, in the last month, and there's a good chance that it went down. It was a higher demand, so less capacity.
Got it. Okay.
I have a question. Does any of these calculations include potentially if a user comes in, because we're in the process of annexing the CAT facility, if a user comes in and needs a lot more water, that changes our projections totally, correct?
It does. It can, if it's a large enough user in there. I mean, based on these projections, again, it's working off a CMAP and the population that was defined in your open areas. If that is a big consideration, we need to add that to the mix and adjust.
Because I think at one point, there was a user that was looking at potentially coming into CAT that would have doubled the water use in Montgomery, is that, if I remember correctly? So, okay, just clarifying, thank you.
Adding all the communities together, the Waterlink communities together, you see what the population is here, with the current population of all three being on the order of 83,000, and then projecting out for 2050 to be over 143,000. The charts on the right look at the demand projected out into 2050, and then you can see how things have changed over time from the 2015 master plan, with water use generally going down, population in the communities, being reduced as for the projection, and therefore the totals generally went down. So Montgomery at 3.4, 5.53. Can't see the cursor on the screen. You're, I guess, let's just say the lowest as far as average day and max day, and then Yorkville and Montgomery are higher based on their average day and max day. Most of the components of the system are sized based on maximum day. So in many instances, the cost is distributed based on the maximum day. Therefore, for Montgomery, again, being the lowest of the three, when we're looking at regional improvements and the distribution of costs, yours are consistent with the lower amount. But you have a lower population amount to spread that across as well out in 2050. Like I said, we're going to try to set up some of these key decisions before we get into each one of the alternatives. So I've got one slide on each one of these: cost, risk, water quality management, staffing, control, governance, sustainability. And then we'll go into more detail as we go. Cost being first. It's now a good time, or do
Are
you
we
want
on
to
like
take
slide 7 or where?
We're on slide 22 of 74.
Sweet. Anybody got to take a break yet, or good? All right, keep going.
Excellent. First thing for key consideration, and some might argue the most important, some may not, because other considerations, especially if costs are similar, might have a higher level of priority. But within cost, it's important for everybody to remember that there are a number of components to cost. And really, there's two main costs that we're going to consider here. There's the supply and treatment costs. And then within the supply and treatment costs, you might have a buy-in or a connection fee. Not alternatives necessarily will, but some do. Then you'll have a capital cost to be able to build the improvements to get it to the village. Then you'll have, in some instances, purchase water costs. So if you're buying water from a commission who's buying water from, say, the city of Chicago, that needs to be factored in. And then you'll have the long-term operation, maintenance, and replacement costs, which would be an annual cost for that system to be able to operate, maintain it, and eventually replace it. So that's supply and treatment. Right now, wells, lime softening plant, ion exchange. We would be looking at primarily separating that out, but don't forget that the other component to cost is your storage, your elevated tanks that we talked about, the distribution system, maintaining your water main, booster pump stations, et cetera. That cost will continue because you'll still have that existing system to operate no matter what supply you bring to the village. That has capital on its own and has operation, maintenance, and replacement as well. So when we get to cost, again, it's important not to just look at the capital costs, put all these together so that we see how they compare for each one of the alternatives. The next key consideration, and again, these are not necessarily in an order, just for you to consider which has the highest priority for you, is risk. And risk is really across the whole process. So there's risk associated with design, risk associated with permitting different alternatives. There could be risk during construction. Depending on the complexity of construction, risk would potentially go up. There's risk financially to the village if it's you on your own. If it's you with a bunch of other communities, spreading out the risks, could reduce risk. And then capacity expansion would be a consideration as well. For you, it's probably not as much of a concern because, again, you're going to hit build out probably even before 2050, some of your neighbors, including down towards the Juliet Water Commission, their build-out could be 2100 or beyond. A lot of these systems are being planned to really meet the capacity for build-out, so that's not as big of an issue, but for instance, when you're talking to Aurora or others, you'll need to make sure that that capacity will continue to be there. Water quality, another key consideration, and this again is kind of in the eye of the beholder. With the different treatment systems, with surface water treatment plant, if you are operating a treatment plant or you're part of a surface water treatment system, there's a certain level of treatment required for that. If you go to Lake Michigan water, then there's a different level of treatment, but that would be on somebody else to control. If, the worst case for a Lake Michigan system probably is you would have to add some chlorine locally because it would be on that supplier to meet the regulatory requirements for that. When looking at the intake location, looking at risk, looking at, what the water quality might be, going into a riverine off of the bank might mean one thing to you. Going into Lake Michigan, into a crib, or even off of the bank of Lake Michigan might mean another thing to you. For seasonal water quality, the Fox River tends to have a little bit higher of a seasonal variation, whereas the Great Lakes have a little bit less. At the end of the day, you have a treatment plant in between, and I will say for each one of these alternatives, we set up the treatment systems to be consistent or to have a consistent effluent quality so that if there was seasonal variations, that it would be able to handle it. And then regulatory compliance and responsibility, like I had said earlier, is that going to be wholly on you if you go alone? Is it going to be you plus your two neighbors, or is it going to be you plus or is it going to be a larger commission, essentially, that's responsible for meeting those regulatory standards? Management and staffing, again, if you're operating your own system, then it's on you to hire all those staff members to be able to operate the supply treatment, and then, of course, the storage and distribution facilities. If it's a commission, it's on them to hire those folks and pay them, and you will pay for it through your purchased water cost. Governance could be something that differentiates, or is something that differentiates each of these alternatives and might mean something more to you than, say, some of these other parameters. Whether or not you end up being a contract purchaser, so you just define a long-term contract, and whatever's in the contract, that's what you have to abide by. Whether you're a member, which also would have a contract that goes with it, but there could be modifications through, if you're on a board and there's a vote, that you would have a say as part of that. And then with those decisions, when you get into the situation where you may be on the board, you might have representation. Are they, one representative, one vote? Are they weighted based on different type of decisions? How many people are on that board? And then lastly, the risk and financial distribution. So from a control and governance perspective, again, is that applied to you on your own or a much larger group in some of these other alternatives? Sustainability, we've already talked about that a lot up front, but just to keep it in mind for the different Fox River alternatives, for the different Lake Michigan alternatives, what backup supply needs would be required and how is the supply redundancy to be established. All right, getting into the different alternatives, and we're almost there where we're going to talk about the specifics, but one last slide to talk about how our approach was to make this apples to apples. Remember that we had costs back in 2015 dollars for some of these alternatives. Then the DWC alternatives were in $17, $18, and then the Joliet area commission was in $20. We need to get those all in the same time frame to make it an appropriate apples-to-apples comparison. What we did then was we established unit prices, or where we had the ability to use unit prices across each one of the alternatives, we did that. So if there's a 24-inch transmission main in an urban area as part of the Joliet alternative, it's the same cost per foot there as it is for a 24-inch transmission main that's coming from DWC, just to make, again, everything consistent across the board. Contingency, this is pretty high level for these systems. Really it's looking at maps, trying to identify the best route. We haven't looked into, all the details. It's just not possible based on this level of analysis. So what the American Council of Estimators has defined as this would be a Class 5 cost estimate. So each one of the alternatives have a 30% contingency. Again, it's apples to apples. It's consistent across the board. And then lastly, the legal and engineering is consistent at 20%. There's a good chance that in some of these, or almost all of them, those costs would come down from the 20%, but we wanted to establish that to be consistent. The 3 Fox River alternatives that we're going to talk about are the 2 that you've looked at before, the Village of Montgomery on its own, and then the Waterlink Fox River system. And then within the last year, the city of Aurora has approached the village and suggested that connecting to their system might be an option. Fox River alone, these slides for each one of the alternatives are set up to be somewhat consistent, walking through an overview and then talking about some of the specific improvements. And then I think it's the 3rd slide in the group that actually gives you the cost. The picture on the upper right, if you haven't been through the village's lime softening water treatment plant, that's what it looks like. And then the exhibit on the left is what would be needed for internal distribution system improvements for this system. The red boxes actually on the exhibit identify what's needed. One of the main things you see there is if the Fox River intake was located just south of the Ashland Avenue Bridge, you would then need a separate transmission main to take the water from the river over to the water treatment plant. There's an existing transmission main for the shallow wells that are over there, but we need an independent line for the Fox River water so that we can separate that for treatment. In addition, there's booster pump station out west and some improvements to the east as well. The specifics for each one of the alternatives are listed here. I wasn't probably going to go through each one of them and identify them. If something comes up on a slide and you want to talk about it specifically, we can. And then you have the handouts for future reference. But there's, a moderate amount of improvements that are needed, not only from supply and treatment, but also a little bit from the distribution. The total cost then for Montgomery alone, please remember that capital cost is only one component. So when we're going to add in other costs later on as we move through the presentation, $61 million roughly for this system. From a sustainability and water quality perspective, there is the low flow potential and seasonal water quality restrictions. That's why you'd have the backup supply. It is a proposed intake that's upstream of Fox Metro in this instance, if that is of any concern. The governance and management, basically you're doing the system on your own, so you have 100% control. The internal system improvements would be the redundancy with supply source here and then having the backup wells. And then the estimated timeline, we're estimating 5 to 7 years for this improvement. Next option is not only the village, again, going to the Fox River on their own, but joining up with Oswego and Yorkville for the Waterlink system. The exhibits to the right, the one in the far right, is the backup well network. The plan would be to tie in several of the village's wells and several of Montgomery and Yorkville's wells. For the analysis purposes, we've identified a intake into the Fox River and a water treatment plant in the Orchard Road Fox River corridor. And then, all the wells again will come back to that treatment plant. The exhibit next to it there on the left is the transmission main. So once that water is treated, again, in this instance, all well water, all Fox River water would be treated in the same location and then distributed out to the community in the transmission mains that are in the exhibit kind of in the middle. And then the lower left exhibit is again, the internal distribution system improvements. For this system, the plan is to have one connection point to the village at Galena Road Extended. So Galena Road just to the east of Orchard Road has been identified as a receiving station for not only this one, but the Lake Michigan alternatives. There would be, then you would have the connection into your overall distribution system to be able to get it into, to be able to distribute it across the full distribution system. The specific improvements, again, are listed out here across the whole slide. Something to point out in general is the backup raw water transmission main, just to give you a perspective, is about 13.5 miles of transmission main, and then Montgomery's share of that ends up to be about 30%. On the treated water transmission main, it's about 18 miles of transmission, and your share, based on, again, the maximum day and how that distributes, is on the order of 17%.
Question, Jeff?
Yes?
On that slide. New backup well.
So when we were looking at the Waterlink system back in 15-16, it was cheaper to construct a well at the water treatment plant than to go to another one of your wells. The distance to get to another one of wells was just more expensive to put that water main in than to put a new one at the plant.
Okay. Thank you.
Mhm. Total cost for this alternative is around $76 million for the capital. A lot of the same components here, certainly from a sustainability and water quality and permitting side of things. The one thing that's slightly different is the intake is projected to be downstream of the Fox Metro Water Reclamation District. The government's management, operational responsibility, in this instance, you're working with your neighbors, Oswego and Yorkville, so some sort of intergovernmental agreement or possibly a new governmental unit would be required, more than likely at what's called a JAWA. You could do a commission, but you might want to look at a Joint Action Water Agency instead, which is set up for a little bit more municipalities joining together without the counties.
The 76 million is all three communities, correct? Or is that just Montgomery?
That's just your share.
Oh, okay.
For
So what is that total? You might have that in your head somewhere.
I might, but I don't think I'll be able to resurrect it.
But it's in the magnitude of like 200 million or something, right?
200, 260 if it's registering right.
Okay.
Because I think the other two communities were, yeah, I think it's around 100.
And okay. And anything that's a shared cost is broken out by our maximum or our peak MGD
Exactly.
at build out.
Yes,
Or at some point,
yes,
yeah.
exactly. Yep,
Got it.
exactly.
All right.
I have another question. In a situation with Waterlink where we're talking about Galena, Galena and Orchard being a connection, though, and maybe this is a silly question, but how do I ask it? The water that's going to Oswego and Yorkville is not going through Montgomery pipes and deteriorating Montgomery pipes, is it?
No, there would be separate transmission mains, or there would be a transmission main backbone here. Again, we can see the cursor, there it is. So this transmission main backbone, I mean, okay, so let's just take the pipe that's coming up to Montgomery. That would carry Oswego's connection up north here, Yorkville's connection to the west, and Oswego's to the east, but it wouldn't be going through your distribution system. The transmission mains would be going to drop-off locations for each one of the three communities.
So in this Waterlink scenario, both, or I guess Montgomery, Yorkville, and Oswego, they all have their water treatment plants that are separate. So we're just getting water to that water treatment plant.
No, you're actually, so you're bringing, the treatment plant would be located,
Okay.
imagine the village's existing lime softening plant, but scale it up for three communities. So we'd put in a new treatment plant here, which would be at Orchard and the Fox River in general. We would have an intake into the Fox River, and we would treat it there. We would also have all these wells that are coming back to that as well for backup. And then that star is in the same star as this location, and then you would distribute that treated water to each one of the systems. So under that scenario, you wouldn't have to keep your existing treatment plants, nor would Yorkville and Oswego in service.
So the 76 million, which is just Montgomery's portion, is to create this, as we go, say we go forward with this option, as Oswego, as all the communities grow, there'd have to be a discussion as far as, hey, you're using X percent of water, you're covering these costs, you're covering those costs, and.
Yeah, I mean, you know, to me, again, if you guys are at build out at 2050, you bought that capacity, if in 2051 or by 2051, if everything landed perfect, which it won't, but the system needs to be expanded, I don't see why Montgomery would have to pay into that because you wouldn't need extra capacity. Now, if you get a high water user, like you had talked about earlier, that could be different, and then you might have to help pay for the expansion of that system.
But in none of these scenarios is our water system connected into anybody else. We're taking delivery of water at one or two locations, and then it's off to the races like we do now.
Exactly.
Yep.
Well, but in the scenario that we just, with New Fox River Water Plant, our water, we're essentially softening.
It's all treated
treating
together?
everyone's water,
True.
and then it's transmitting to
Yeah, but
Montgomery.
it's treated water that's being pumped into Montgomery, Yorkville, and Oswego separately.
Our
Okay.
distribution network stays the same.
Yeah. So
Okay.
you're taking
It's
delivery.
still
at one
going through
location.
the pipes that we have now. It's just coming in on a big pipe instead of coming out of
And
the wells.
in this Waterlink option, we would still keep our wells and everything as backup.
Some of them would be connected into the system. You can actually see them on this exhibit here. So we had this is well 15, which is out by the police station. This is well 14, which is by the Fairfield tank. This is an area where we've targeted for quite a while, well 16. So those 3 wells would tie in. This is Yorkville, a potential future Yorkville well at Route 47. So you would tie those in. You would have to decide, for instance, if you want to leave well 8. Well 8 is on the east side of the river over here. That might be a strategic one to keep in service. If there was an issue, then you've got some new supply on the east side. You'd also probably want to talk about getting an interconnect with Oswego on the east side, because if it was just your main, for instance, coming up that was challenged, then maybe they've got water in their system, they could share it with you.
Does that projected cost include land for this potential treatment plant?
It does.
Okay, thank you.
On the Fox River standalone, you pointed out that there may have been a benefit of the intake being north of Fox Metro. This option, the intake being south of Fox Metro. Any other negatives to this option here being south of the treatment plant?
I'm an engineer, so I don't have concerns about treating the water above or below Fox Metro and achieving, what's needed from regulatory compliance. It's more to point it out for you if that is something that has any level of concern for you. Location-wise, you could make an argument that the intake south of Fox River hydraulically is a little bit better because any of the water that Aurora took out, which their intake is up by Indian Trail, Sullivan actually, I guess, it's just south of Sullivan. They don't return, all that water to the river until Fox Metro, which is downstream of you. So if you're taking out ahead of that, theoretically, some of that water, certain times of the year, could be a little bit of a percentage overall, whereas if you're downstream of Fox Metro, you for sure got all of Aurora's water coming back into the river.
There's more water in the river south of Fox Metro.
It's just a mind thing,
Yes.
because as you go down the river, the water is all reused and,
Yeah, all the water on the planet.
right,
Yeah,
we
so-
would like to think that it's all pristine, never been through any sort of treatment plant, but that's not the truth.
Think about the Mississippi River.
Or people's kidneys.
Wonderful image.
But
Thank you.
and the reason why Jeff mentions that, though, is public perception. It's a question you would get asked, so it's something we should think about.
Okay, I think we were on the price one, right? So $76 million for the Waterlink alternative. Like we talked about, the Jawa, you'd have joint ownership now with the communities. The internal system improvements would be required as well. And then the estimated timeline, because it's a larger system and you have more, transmission mains to put in, it's a longer implementation timeframe, suggesting 9 to 11 years for this system. And then the last Fox River system, which we've made reference to this several times, is connecting to the city of Aurora's system. We've had really good discussions with them, talking about the engineering side of it, the hydraulics, where might be good options to connect. You can see them on this exhibit. There's 4 locations. My cursor in the right spot here. Based on, so it's important that the hydraulics of the system can work, and the elevation of their water levels in their Barnes Road standpipe versus the elevation in their water towers, how can that transition into the village's different pressure zones? The short story is they don't have water levels as high as the Fairfield tank out west, so we need to focus on, nor does it make sense to actually bring into Ogden Hills tank on the far east. So all 4 of the connections are identified in the village's central pressure zone, which is the purple pressure zone, and then you have pumps within your system already, and we would add new pump stations to be able to transfer the water out of the purple zones into the yellow and green. The 4 locations, one here at Orchard and Jericho, basically, is a connection. One coming down Route 31 to, not too far away from where your lime softening plant is today, up north of that. Another connection down here, which is around Pearl and Sherman, coming down to where your well 8 is generally. And then this last one on the east side is coming down Hill Avenue to Montgomery Road and tying in near Parkview Estates. With those 4 connections, then again, hydraulically, the system can work well. There is some internal distribution systems that are required, but it's actually fairly limited for this system. These are just the specifics then that I mentioned here. At each one of the connection points, you would have to have a vault that would have a meter in it so that they can measure the amount of flow that's being transmitted to your system and then ultimately bill you for it.
Jeff, can you go back one slide?
Sure.
So does this mean that out by well 15, which is out in Fairfield, right?
Yeah.
Is that, or no, well 15 is the PD?
Correct.
Is the PD.
Well,
So
yes.
does this mean that we're not using the storage tank in Foxmore Fairfield because
No.
it's above?
We would. So what has to happen is the water would come into this zone, and then you have an existing Horseman Trail booster pump station. It's that building out in front of Walmart that takes water essentially out of this zone and pumps it up so that it can fill the Fairfield elevated tank. And then for redundancy, we suggested a second booster pump station, kind of all-cut extended, that would be able to, again, take the water out of this zone and pump it up. So instead of having a well in that zone, you're just taking treated water out of that central zone and pumping it up.
Okay, that's fine. It wasn't on the map, and I'm thinking it's.
Sure. No, I get it. Sorry. Yeah, we
No,
cut it
that's
off
okay.
to be able to show
Thank
it a
you.
little bit easier.
If you can't fit it in the picture, it means we don't have to put water there.
Okay, so this alternative, good news is the capital cost is certainly lower at $43.8 million, but again, please remember that there's other costs that need to be added to this, which we'll provide a little bit later. So the Aurora, for the water quality, permitting, sustainability side of it, they blend the Fox River and well water like we've talked about. They would be responsible for the treatment and transmission, wholly responsible. And then you probably would keep some, again, wells maintained for emergency use, but you'd have to decide, like maybe it makes sense for 14 and 15 to stay for emergency use to start out with. Or if you connect, say, 15 to their system, maybe you keep 14 just in case for a while. Governance, management, there's no direct ownership, but you also essentially are just bound by an agreement. Whatever that agreement says, you would have to set it up as strong as certainly possible, that have presumably a method, for instance, for how they would charge you for the water rate, a volumetric rate, buying cost, other things. They've given us some parameters, which we factored in now, but it would be key within that agreement to get that solidified to your satisfaction. There would be the internal distribution system improvements, like we mentioned, but not too bad because of the 4 connection points. The buying costs in this particular alternative are significant. In fact, they're the highest of all the alternatives being looked at. Because of the connections being relatively straightforward, we're suggesting that if you wanted to, you could implement the system as soon as 4 to 5 years.
Can you say that last whole paragraph again? The buy-in costs are what?
The buy-in cost as being proposed right now for the City of Aurora's system are the highest of any of the buy-in costs for the different alternatives. And when I'm talking about the buy-in cost in this instance, it's buying the capacity in the system. So DWC is going to charge you a certain amount to buy, the extra capacity that they have in that, and that is on the order of $10 million. For this one, they're suggesting that you would pay roughly $1.2 million every year for the term of the agreement, and we've generally talked about a minimum would be a 30-year agreement, so that would be $33 million. The Juliet system, you'll see, is a little bit funky in the sense that the buy-in cost is buying all the transmission main capacity too. It's not really an apples to apples. For them, it's kind of different there. So it looks higher at the $74 million, but when you're just looking at, again, buying capacity of the existing system, not getting the pipes from there to you, this ends up being the highest of the alternatives.
It's like your impact fee, like for development.
But it's an impact fee for 30 years. So
Yeah.
Life of the agreement.
Yep.
All right, Lake Michigan alternatives are on slide 40 of 74. Still okay?
Anybody yet? We're getting to the good part.
I'm getting close.
Yeah, I'm getting close too.
All right, well, we can get through the supply alternatives, and then we'll take a time out before we get into costs to really build the suspense. The 3 Lake Michigan alternatives are Dupage Water Commission, the Juliet Area Water Commission, the Illinois Lake Water Company. The Dupage Water Commission, they at this time have 29 members as part of that commission. There were 23 that were charter members, obviously around or within DuPage County, and then the 6 added later on. When the commission was created back in the 80s, they established a 40-year contract with the city of Chicago to get treated water and then distribute it to their customers. They've aligned all of their contracts, even ones that have come in recently, to end when their contract ends with the city of Chicago in 2024. And then I'm going to come back to that point in a second, but just to finish the last bullet on this slide, there's a 13-member Water Commission board. The county is broken up into 6 districts, so each one of those districts has 1 municipal representative and 1 county representative. And then the chair of the Water Commission is also appointed by the county. So there's 13 total, 7 that would be county-oriented, 6 that would be municipal. They have talked about the potential of the Waterlink communities, if you come in together, seeking revision to the state statute, which would be required if you want to, or if you jointly want to, create a new district, so make a 7th district that Oswego, Yorkville, and Montgomery would be part of, and then presumably there would be 1 representative of the 3 of you as part of that, but you would, again, need to change the state statute. Going back to the City of Chicago's agreement, do we want to talk about that first?
No, it's fine.
Okay.
It's interesting, though, that it would be 14 then, so I wonder if the county would want to add on 1 additional. But at any rate, that's way down the road.
I think that's a safe assumption.
So let's talk a second about the water supply contract with the City of Chicago. Currently, the City of Chicago charges everybody the same rate, meaning if you're a City of Chicago resident, you are charged $4.12 per 1,000 gallons. If you are the Dupage Water Commission or the North Suburban Municipal Jawa, who buy wholesale from the City of Chicago, you pay $4.12 per 1,000 gallons. Exactly the same amount per 1,000 gallons. DuPage Water Commission, because they have a system that they had to build, operate, maintain, they add 85 cents to that. So their current rate is $4.97 a 1,000 gallons. And it basically has been that structure since they started their contract. When Juliet started to negotiate a contract with the City of Chicago, they asked, and it was granted, to move to what's called a cost of service rate. The cost of service rate takes into account only the facilities that you use to get your water. So for instance, under the Juliet Commission, they, as in the Juliet Commission, would use the portion of Chicago's system that includes the intake, one of their 2 intakes into Lake Michigan, the singular water treatment plant that Joliet will get their water from. Chicago has 2. They have the Eugene Sawyer plant, which is the southernmost one. That's where Joliet will get it from. The northern one is called Jardine. If you've ever been to Navy Pier, it's right next to it. Dupage Water Commission actually gets their water from Jardine. So under the Joliet system, intake into Lake Michigan that goes into the Sawyer plant, there's a tunnel that brings the water out to the Durkin pump station, so they would pay their share of the water transferring through that tunnel, any portion of that pump station that's needed, and then define what that rate is, essentially just for those components. So Joliet wouldn't be paying for the distribution system maintenance that they don't use. They wouldn't be paying for lead service lines that need to be replaced in the city of Chicago. They wouldn't be paying for the pensions for people outside of the water treatment plants, et cetera. With that conversion, based on current cost of service calculation, remember again, existing rate 412, the Joliet negotiated, it would land somewhere around $2.50 if they bought that water today. Dupage has stated that they've had some conversations with Chicago, and with the expiration of their agreement, they think there's a good chance that that model will apply to them as well. No guarantees because it's still part of the contract. One of the benefits of Dupage's contract is that they do have the favors nations clause. So if another system, for instance, gets a lower rate, then they have stated within their contract, it says they get that lower rate too. But it could be argued also that Joliet's not getting water until 2030, so it could be that time frame until then. Nevertheless, if Dupage gets that lower rate, cost of service rate, that could make a big difference. When we get into the cost comparisons later on, we do it 2 ways for the Dupage Water Commission. One way is to say, if you keep with the $4.97 that they currently are, and that continues to increase at 1% per year, which is what seems to be consistent with their rate increases between Chicago and Dupage. The other alternative is using a water rate that's very similar to Joliet's water rate and factoring that in. So again, we'll see that later on, but just wanted to introduce that now. Any questions on that particular topic?
What's Montgomery's rate per thousand?
Your rate per thousand right now is on the order of $6.80. There we go, per 1,000 gallons. Now remember, the $6.80 per 1,000 gallons includes supply, treatment, storage, distribution. Approximately, what do we do here? 55% of your current rate is still needed to operate your distribution and storage facilities. I think it was 15% is on the order for debt service, and then the remainder, which I think would be, what, 25? Justin, correct my math there, would be the existing supply and treatment. So 55%, again, you have to maintain, and then you'd have to stack on top of that what's needed to implement the supply and treatment.
With this being a 40-year contract that Dupage is on, we're going into almost 2 years away from the conclusion of that. How soon would they begin negotiating and bargaining a contract of that size?
They actually already have started negotiating it. It's my understanding that those discussions are going well, and that, again, Chicago is considering an alternative rate structure. I don't know if in any of your meetings they've talked about when that might be solidified.
I don't remember them saying that. I know Chicago has a deputy commissioner now that's solely focused on, I forget what his title is, regional water. So they're motivated for sure. And I know we've had several meetings with Dupage Water Commission over the last 9 months, and they've been negotiating the whole time, so.
So at any point in time, we may hear what that negotiated new rate could be.
Could be. I mean, unfortunately, it could be next year too, and more than likely would need to make a decision before you know that for sure. Internal improvements, basically 2 receiving stations for this one, and then you'll see it again in Joliet. the one at Galena Road extended to the east, and then the one, then we're suggesting one at the Ogden Hill tank. Because the Lake Michigan system requires 2 days of water storage, which roughly equates to about 8 million gallons of storage, we'll need to add storage at each one of those receiving stations, then a booster pump station to go with it. Because your transmission system or distribution system in between is in pretty good shape, there's not really much required as far as internal distribution and system improvements for this. These are the specifics, specifically 500,000 gallon ground storage tanks at both your west and your east receiving stations. You would modify the lime softening plant into a pumping station to be able to utilize storage there, and then some other miscellaneous improvements. The total capital cost for the Dupage Water Commission for the improvements that we've talked about specific to this alternative is roughly $66 million. Again, this is Montgomery's share. The total cost, is, 3 to 3.5 times that for all the communities together. Sustainability and water quality. In this instance, for Lake Michigan water, there's really no seasonal restrictions. They have the ability to withdraw from Lake Michigan. Once you get your allocation, then it's defined how much water you can get. Your share of Lake Michigan water and working through either of these commissions. Chicago would be responsible for the treatment and transmission, and then DWC would pick up after that. In this instance, being the Lake Michigan system, you'd probably keep those wells online, at least some of them, for backup. Here, for governance, management, operation responsibility, and risk, you don't have any direct ownership, and then you just have to see how it fits in with board representation. The internal system improvements are, the receiving stations like we talked about. In this one, again, they have buy-in costs on the order of $10 million. They've suggested that they could get you connected as soon as 4 to 5 years. If you could work through all the process from a permitting, allocation, et cetera. We have a slide a little bit later on for your consideration on whether, you want to connect sooner rather than later, or if you might want to be able to work off the existing system for a couple more years. Juliet water system, there's 12 communities that are considering connection to the Juliet system. It will be a brand new system, getting City of Chicago of water and bringing that down to the region and distributing it. Because it's a new system, you have the opportunity to become a charter member. Each member would have a representative on the board. So if all 12 join, there would be 12 members on the board. If half of them join, and it included you, you would be 1 out of 6. The upper exhibit just shows a general schematic. The connection to the city of Chicago is 84th and Kedvale. If you're familiar with that area, there's actually a park there. There's an existing pump station from the city of Chicago. The Juliet improvements will include a new pump station, and then it's approximately 30 miles to get from that all the way down to Juliet. Depending on which communities join, there could be a reason to come west, for instance, out of Romeoville, rather than going all the way down to Juliet and coming back up. But it will depend on, again, which communities join. Your internal you would have the 2 receiving stations, like I had mentioned, the west and the east, and then because of your distribution system being in good shape, you wouldn't have a lot of improvements there. So this page looks very similar to the Dupage Water Commission system. The primary difference in cost is the treated water transmission main. So the cost for you to join the Juliet Water Commission, the capital cost is $85.4 million. Again, just for the components related to connecting to the system. And all this is very similar, other than maybe a little bit of a differentiation with the governance.
And talk about the no earlier than 2030.
So based on the size scale of the system, the likelihood of getting the system online before 2030 just seems a little unrealistic. If all 12 communities join, this could be $1 billion improvement. So to be able to accomplish that in less than 9 years would be difficult. That may, though, be a good thing for you. If you're not ready to connect earlier than that, if you want to continue to operate your existing system, your wells definitely have sustainability to get you there, then there could be a decent amount or a high amount of cost savings for an extra 4 or 5 years.
What was the buy-in cost on this one?
So the buy-in costs on this one are a little bit different in the sense that when they establish their buy-in cost, it's $12.9 million times your maximum day demand. But what you get for that $12.9 million times your maximum day demand is water to each one of your receiving stations. Pretty much. I mean, your secondary station, you have to pay a little bit more. So you get enough water, I should have said, enough water to your primary receiving station. All those pipes, those transmission mains are built into it. The way that the Juliet Commission is set up is it's all for one, one for all. So everybody gets charged the same amount, that $12.9 million times the maximum day demand. If you're farther away, you don't pay any more than actually somebody that's close by. The thought being with more communities that join, the economy of scale gets better, you put those across a larger population.
Thank you.
Illinois Lake Water System, this is more or less a subsidiary of Illinois American, which you're probably a little more familiar with. They operate a system that comes out from Bedford Park and then provides water to Bolingbrook, Homer Glen to the east, and then Plainfield to the west. They've approached the Waterlink region to suggest that they have some improvements that they're already planning to do to expand that system, and if it made sense to expand it to be able to take on the Waterlink communities too, now would be a good time for that. We have continued to work with them, or actually I should say the Oswego Studies consultant has continued to work with them, but haven't actually gotten to the point where they've been able to provide cost estimates. So today we're just talking about it in general from a private utility, which Illinois American is a private utility, providing water to you, but we don't have any cost for the system yet.
Can you just go back to one slide?
Mm-hmm.
The water starts in Lake Michigan. And can you go through the ownership between there and Plainfield?
Yes. So Chicago starts in Lake Michigan and goes to the Chicago South plant. So this is that Eugene Sawyer plant. I'm sorry, here's the crib, the Dunn crib that brings the water into it. And then the city of Chicago basically distributes that water to a number of communities. You can see all the dots here, one of which is Bedford Park. I'm sure you've heard the advertisements on the radio that Bedford Park has a lot of water. They then, that's being Illinois Lake Water, has constructed a transmission main from Bedford Park that comes all the way out and provides to, again, Bolingbrook, Plainfield, and Homer Glen. A portion of this system has to be upgraded to be able to achieve that capacity. So you'd have to go back into this system, increase pipe sizes, or do a secondary pipe most likely next to it to be able to serve all the way out to Plainfield, and then you would daisy chain on from that to head out to Waterlink. So if, for instance, the connection was on the east side of Plainfield, you would come across and then distribute. This pipe network looks very similar actually to DWC's pipe network, and you'll see it's very similar to Juliet's. Once it gets in this region, it's all about hitting the receiving stations that are the dots here in each one of your 3 communities. Internal distribution system improvements, again, pretty limited because of the strength of the system. These are the improvements, again, very similar to the others. At the receiving stations would have those ground storage tanks along with the booster pump stations, and the costs, again, here are to be determined. Because it's Lake Michigan water, there would be no seasonal restrictions as well. In this case, Illinois American, the private utility, would be responsible for treatment and transmission. You would probably keep those existing wells online for backup. From a governance management perspective, you would enter in a supply agreement with them, just like you would, say, for the city of Aurora. In this instance, it is a private utility, so the structure and then the rate would likely be different. You wouldn't have any direct ownership or control over the source water or transmission mains. Again, they would own all those. That could be considered a benefit. Internal improvements, like we've already talked about, and the time frame here could be as soon as 4 to 5 years if they're able to implement all that together. But again, it might be something that you would want to take a little bit longer. Got probably 2 more slides and then.
Sure. You want to go through the non-revenue stuff and then we'll stop? Okay, I get it.
Probably.
Do it.
Okay. So these were all the improvements to basically get the water to the Village of Montgomery, and then within the Village of Montgomery, any conveyance or hydraulic improvements to get the water across the system or storage and all that. If you get an allocation from Lake Michigan, you are required to get your non-revenue water